Welcome to another sequence of reflections with the Course in Miracles. I'm glad to find you in my mind well, and of course well aligned with his mind, and rejoicing that of which we indeed cannot really talk, but of course we do try to express it no matter in what situation. If we are coming from a completely mundane worldly problem in which the ego operates and tries to make its point. It's always like I see that in the bureaucratic expressions, how that is orchestrated. It's basically like two ways of seeing it, and there's this side and then there's this office or that side, and there's no communication going on whatsoever, and nobody knows really what the other is doing in this waiting then that the other side should do something or be operative, and yeah, whatever. It's really a funny game here in time space, and what I'm learning here is definitely to enjoy myself in it instead of getting annoyed or upset. It's really not worse, and that is what Jesus tries to, in his Course in Miracles, to teach us in this sequence of the beginning of this second section. I mean, it's amazing, if we are looking at that, we have done literally this first part, which is the undoing part, where all these ego perspectives or judgmental ideas of real, this is real and this has this meaning and this means this and that, is really being undone. Like your mind, our mind, in that vertical alignment and connection with the Holy Spirit, is now perfectly capable to distinguish, at least distinguish between that what represents the truth, which is creative thought, and that what it comes from one's own making, from one's own hallucination, which he calls illusionary thought or conceptual mind. I call it ego mind. It's used in the Course in Miracles term, whatever determines the separation. And so being capable to distinguish between these two thought systems, that of course opens the mind automatically to what now in this second part is supposed to be accomplished, so that energy, that light of creative mind, really completely sinks down into the soul itself, into the heart of hearts, where it becomes a complete certainty of knowingness. Let's say it's not even an expression of I know who I am, or I know who you are, or I know what the universe is. It's a knowingness that doesn't need a definition in itself. And of course, in the Course in Miracles, he talks about that knowledge and perception is being brought to knowledge, and knowledge is of God and is in God. So whenever you reopen your mind to that knowingness, to knowledge itself, that is what we call experience, capitalized, of God as what you are. And so in that lesson that we are also doing today, God is my Father and he loves his Son, and tomorrow God is my Father and his Son loves him, is really that emphasis given to accept, okay, I am not something different or anybody different than what is called the Holy Son of God, what the direct extension of creation from creator to the created is. That is what the Son is. It really, in that sense, has nothing to do whatsoever with Christianity, because we are using here Christian terms. It is really all about reality, truth itself. And whatever vernacular we are using, whatever language we use to express that, is really nothing else than a memory of the past in our mind, so that we can reconnect energetically easily. And it could be any vernacular of language, of religion that we would use with the same content and the same experience. And so in this second part, from lesson 221 to 365, where we find ourselves now, Jesus gives in his Course in Miracles, in that guideline, in that form of guiding the human mind back to its original source, to its original state of mind. He gives for every 10 days an idea, a special idea to contemplate on and, and utilize also in the daily lesson. So that idea for this sequence is what is forgiveness. And I will read you a part which will connect very well where we left it in chapter 4, because we are this time now looking at the perspective of how we reflect literally those terms that are so connected with the ego thought system, and where the ego reality or expression needs undoing or is being undone. And one of these ideas is, of course, the idea of abundance. The ego doesn't know of abundance whatsoever. Abundance is a thought that is just reflecting the open mind and gives to itself abundantly, no? Without any limits, without any conditions, without reservation. And so that action that mind is giving, which is a natural state anyway, it is just the question, is mind extending itself unlimited? So giving without limits, without concepts, without that separation of cause and effect, where it is determined, oh, I'm giving this and now I need to receive that. So when that is all one thing, when it becomes just the one extending of thought as the extension of the mind, as giving to itself, that's really what abundance is. And so he will talk in this section that we are doing today, which is still the continuation in the edited version of section 2, and in the complete and annotated edition, we will go and begin with the fourth section of chapter 4, and I will use even the unedited version to the complete and annotated version, which is literally what the direct words are when Jesus gave it to Helen in the notes. They are called the notes, right? And so before going into this chapter 4, again, just making here a point with where we are in that lesson, in that, okay, here is an undoing of ego thought system happening and wanted and willed, and that will open up the mind to abundance. And of course, we start always with that conversion of looking at, okay, where was my defense? Where was my resistance? Where was my self-concept in that? And in that lesson 224 and 225, I could even take tomorrow's lesson also with it, where where he expresses even in the prayer form, where it is directed to, okay, my name of Father still is known to you, but then he brings up that part that I have forgotten it, So the reality I still believe in, or I think it has any effect on me, is actually that forgetting thought. I'm here in time space. Every mind walking in time space is here for remembrance, to remember what is indeed my true name, as God. As God's name given to his son, you could say. No? And so I've forgotten it and do not know where I'm going, who I am, and what it is I do. These are the effects of forgetting who I was, who I am, and forgetting my true identity. That is the human condition. That's how separation started. This is what we bring now to an end and see, indeed, through experience again, it already has ended. Indeed, it has ended the moment there was the first sense of separation. The answer was given from God Himself. And in that tomorrow's lesson, then, so to speak, 225, or whenever you listen to this podcast, God is my Father and His Son loves Him. He brings it into the perspective in prayer form. Father God, I must return. Your love for me, for giving and receiving are the same, and you have given all your love to me. So this is what we are remembering, right? And in this remembrance, of course, it shows up and comes very strongly into our sense and mind. I must return that. I must return this love. This is the only thing that has been given us as His Son. So I want it mine in full awareness, placing in my mind, keeping it within its kindly light, inviolate, violet, beloved, with fear behind and only peace ahead. How still the way your loving Son is led along you. So very beautifully also expresses then, yes, we are one, and it is but this oneness that we seek as we accomplish these few final steps which end a journey that was not begun. There it is. The journey was already at its end the moment it the mind realized its separation. At that point, also the journey ended, or the journey home indeed didn't even begin. This is all part of the dreaming. Okay, now I'm a Course in Miracles teacher or student, and this is what I'm doing now, and I'm training my mind and all. It's all part of the dreaming sequence. This all will have its end because it had already its end. That includes all transformative action within our mind. I love that really a lot. And on the way, as long as it is believed that it has a value and there is something that is yearning for correction or for seeing it differently, let's express it, then of course I will utilize those words that are given me in my mind from His mind, from Christ Himself, from out of time. And how I call that is really has nothing to do with that, like we're calling it Holy Spirit, we're calling it Jesus, we're calling it God Himself. It really doesn't matter. It's really it what is the result. That is what matters. Am I losing I lose the world from all I thought it was, and that world is my own self-reflection. That is what it is all about. It's really this return into love and light where all the illusions disappear, what it is all about. And so, of course, that part that we call the ego is determining or constantly trying to make real or holding real, because it is the belief that there's reality in the objective reality, in objective perception. I see something outside myself, and because I can maybe touch it or whatever sense is involved in it, therefore it must be real. That is what the mind training from the beginning in the undoing process makes emphasis, to bring that concept to the clarity that this is not there, it is meaningless. But everything that is seen in separation, in the world as the world, or in a relationship as the me with the world, is really where the judgment comes in, or the belief in judgment. And he calls that clearly, that is what an unforgiven thought is. Forgiveness teaches me, speaking for myself, to see that nothing has occurred here, nothing has been done to me, nothing has affected me. I am still as God created me. And everything else to believe or see, still see, anything. If I see here a laptop in front of me, that's an effect of an unforgiving thought, because that will disappear. It has not an eternal nature in it. So he makes here very clear, and just to reviewing that out of this, what is forgiveness, where he makes the point and teaches me about that awareness of unforgiving ego thought. The unforgiving thought is one which makes a judgment. Here it is. It makes a judgment that it will not raise to doubt. It will hold on. It will believe. It will defend it. It will say, yes, this is so. Yeah, I know this is so. No? It will not raise to doubt, although it is not true. Thank you. This is really the teaching that we were asking for, and that we really want to hear. And thank you for your remarks in the chat, and everybody who listens later on to it definitely can relate with that from one's own experience. The mind is closed, when the mind is still defending unforgiving thought, or is trying to offer an unforgiving thought, a judgmental thought, then that mind is literally closed and will not be released. The thought protects projection, there's the defense, the projection, tightening its chains so that distortions are more veiled and more obscure, less easily accessible to doubt or to question it, and further kept from reason. What can come between a fixed projection and the aim that it has chosen as its wanted goal? Question, that's what needs to come into all projection and fixed projections. And the aim that the closed mind has chosen as its wanted goal is literally its own death or its denial of reality. And what needs to come in between is, of course, the light and love of that forgiveness brings. But an unforgiven thought does many things. In frantic action, it pursues its goal, twisting and overturning what it sees as interfering with its chosen path. Distortion is its purpose and the means by which it would accomplish it as well. It sets about its furious attempts to smash reality without concern for anything that would appear to pose a contradiction to its point of view. And then he gives all these wonderful expressions and teachings about what forgiveness does, that it is really still and does nothing within the dream. It does nothing with the magical thoughts. It does nothing with the ego thoughts. It just remembers that any offense of the ego would actually make it real and give it energy. So we learn to not involve ourselves in that anymore. Forgiveness offends no aspect of reality, nor seeks to twist it to appearances it likes. It merely looks, waits, and judges not. Thank you. So this is very, very valuable. Everybody who wants to teach his own realization of that alignment of that knowingness of the mind of the Son of God with his Creator, and wants to teach that and does teach it, definitely sees the value of this expression as it is given here in this Course in Miracles. And from here, we're going to go where we left it in chapter 4. And there were these last sentences that were quite interesting, where we left it in the last episode, because there was the expression given that what he was talking about also the attitudes that are necessarily conflicted, because then it is realized that all attitudes are ego-based, and then he gives the perspective that this will not last. There is a solution inside. And this last sentence, if you remember it, was saying, so be patient a while, and remember what we have said once before: the outcome is as certain as God. So there's no failure possible. The outcome is as certain as God. Once there is the clear determination within the human mind in its application of patience and tolerance and all the characteristics of a teacher of God, to see that that undoing process of ego-oriented thinking, or what determines the ego thought system, really just needs to be willed for to be undone. It is by the willpower, it even stronger than just to desire it a little bit and wish for it and pray for it, but to say I will to see that differently is really where it is given immediately. And we continue here with well, there was in the notes still a quote before we continue with the Complete and Annotated Edition in the fourth section of chapter 4, where he said, Helen used to perceive the quotation, to him that has shall be given, as a paradox that bordered on the ironic. She also had a similar reaction to another related one: faith is the gift of God. But we have reinterpreted both of these statements before, but perhaps we can make them even clearer now. And then he continues saying, only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. So we have that, of course, also in the edited versions. Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance. That comes of, as we were saying at the very beginning, to allow ourselves, our being, our soul being, to just extend, to just give, and to give what is real, to give love, light, peace. That is the only sense that is truly charitable. This is quite obvious when you consider the concepts involved. To be able to give anything implies that you can do without it. Even if you associate giving with sacrifice, you still give only because you believe you are somehow getting something better, so that you can do without the thing you give. Now he brings in that term, how the ego and then teaches it and tries to keep it. Giving to get, it's called. Giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego. That is the exchange. I give you something, but you have to return something, and it needs to be, as he was just expressing it, at least equal. But in my mind, I could make it up even as seeing it better and more. No? So that's how the ego law operates. No? A law of the ego which always evaluates itself in relation to others' egos, and is therefore continually preoccupied with the scarcity principle. So within the ego law, there's a scarcity principle, the principle of littleness, the principle of loss, which gave rise to it. This is the meaning of Freud's pleasure principle. Sigmund Freud, was the most accurate ego psychologist we ever had, although he would not have preferred this description himself. His ego was a very weak and deprived concept, which could function only as a thing in need. The reality principle now, in that context of ego, scarcity principle. The reality principle of the ego is not real at all. It is forced to perceive the, under quotes, reality, the reality of other egos, because it cannot establish the reality of itself. In fact, its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. So it's just a convincing, a persuasion, a conviction. Self-esteem, also under quotes. Let's see what he has to say in that respect, because of course many esoteric group and teachers first teach self-esteem in order to come to a certain power, then to will and to want more for themselves. But of course, this is also something that is still part of the ego. And here he talks about it and says, self-esteem in ego terms means nothing more than that the ego has deluded itself into accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. So because he believes I'm well off anyway, and I know it better than you, or have more than you, and so on and so forth. So it becomes then kind of content with itself, and temporarily is the word. Temporarily it becomes less predatory. This self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, a term which really means that a condition has arisen in which the delusion of reality of the ego is threatened. This produces either ego deflation or ego inflation, resulting in either withdrawal or attack. The ego literally lives by comparisons. This means that equality is beyond its grasp and charity becomes impossible. So, of course, the entire human story in separation is relating to what he explains here, as you might have noted already in this last, or you must have understood that these first chapters, especially these first maybe 5 chapters or even first 9, 10 chapters, is very much about demonstrating and teaching how the human mind has held ideas and translated it into psychology, let's say, into a psychology of the ego. So he starts out there of showing where the limitation of the psychology of the human conceptual mind lies, so that we can make a new decision, choose anew, right? So it is kind of, especially for those, and as you know, Helen Schackman and Bill Tedford, they were in psychologists. So the those who are not so well connected with psychological terms or understanding might not be so interested in this teaching of these first chapters, especially at the beginning here in the original version that we call the Urtext. But for my mind, I find it very interesting because I see it anyway that everything of ego thought forms is being undone. And of course, there cannot be anything left not being undone. Everything goes home, everything disappears in that correction of what forgiveness offers. So continuing here, he says, then the ego never gives out of abundance. That's also what I chose, kind of the title, to see that, okay, there is a true giving out of abundance from our higher mind, from our true vertical alignment with his mind. But from anything left on the ego level, it cannot arrive. It is never abundantly given. There's always a reservation there. So the ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. The ego was made, I made that up in my own mind, you made that up as a substitute to substitute abundance. This is why the concept of getting arose in the ego thought system. I need. All appetites are getting mechanisms. All appetites. So that doesn't exclude the necessity or that habit to eat food. And to have appetite for food. It's also a getting mechanism. All appetites are getting mechanisms representing ego needs to confirm itself. This is as true of bodily appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. The higher ego needs are then these self-justifications of even saying, well done, do you see what great student and teacher I am? How far I'm doing this course now, 25, 30 years or more, and I want to be acknowledged as and recognized as that. No? That are the ego's higher needs. And just one example. No? And Jesus says here, this is as true of bodily appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Bodily appetites are not physical in origin because the ego regards the body as its home and thus try to satisfy itself through the body. So it uses the body as a means also to satisfy that is in the mind and is yearning to get something, to fulfill that appetite. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the ego, which is completely confused about what is really possible. This accounts for its essential erraticness, he calls it here. Consider the inevitable confusion which must arise from a perception of the self, which responds, when I was completely on my own, I, under quotes, had no idea what was possible. When I was completely on my own, I had no idea what was possible. The ego does believe it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it originated. As a simple thought by itself, not in connection with the universe, with God's mind at all. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and unite with them in a feeble attempt of identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. The ego is free to complete the stem when I was completely on my own in any way it chooses, but it is not free to consider the validity of the premise itself, because this premise is its foundation. The ego is the belief of the mind that it is completely on its own. That's the premise. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the soul's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are utterly useless. The soul in its knowledge is unaware of the ego. It does not attack the ego. We had that, right, in What is Forgiveness. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. It overlooks it, it doesn't put even any meaning to it. It doesn't know anything about it. It just looks through it. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. There's nothing there that it could be conceived of. While the ego is equally unaware of the soul, it does perceive itself as rejected by something which is greater than itself. This is what self-esteem in ego terms why. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be a delusion. The creations of God do not create myth, but the creative efforts of man can turn to mythology, but only under one condition. What man then makes is no longer creative. Wow, there you have it. What man then makes is no longer creative. It is, of course, the energy or the force of creation was used to make up my own creations, under quotes, but it was no longer creative. It was dedicated to coming and going, all an idea of death. Myths are entirely perceptions and are so ambivalent in form and so characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful components, if only in innuendo. Myth and magic are closely associated. Very interesting, because that's like in that age or where we find ourselves, where conspiracies are presented as realities and become so important in demonstrations, if political or whatever level. Everything that is just hallucinated and made up, and in that sense is a myth, where the narrative is just so many times sold until the conceptual mind believes in it. But here Jesus relates to that by just expressing myth and magic are closely associated, in that myth are usually related to the ego origins and magic to the powers which the ego ascribes to itself. Every mythological system includes an account of, under quotes, the creation, and associates this with its particular perception of magic. Here's another term, the battle for survival. The battle of survival is nothing more than the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is always associated with physical birth, because nobody maintains that the ego existed before that point in time. The religiously ego-oriented tend to believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist afterward, after a temporary lapse into ego life. Some actually believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse, even though in reality it could not possibly know anything about it. The term salvation doesn't apply to the soul, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged. Salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the soul, but which must be accomplished before one-mindedness can be restored. Right-mindedness dictates the next step automatically, because right perception is uniformly without attack, so that wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. The directions which the mind will take are always automatic, because they can but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. Every thought system has interval consistency, and this does provide a basis for the continuity of behavior. However, this is still reliability and not validity. Reliable behavior is a meaningful perception as far as ego thinking goes. However, valid behavior is an expression which is inherently contradictory, because validity is an end and behavior is a means. This cannot be combined logically, because when an end has been attained, the means for its attainment are no longer meaningful. They disappear literally. They are so very interesting how in detail and how he wants to clarify this difference between reliable behavior and valid behavior. And also what we were hearing before, that battle for survival that really comes from that, you could say, separation thought of this interpretation of the ego struggle to preserve itself since the beginning. And it is what I said before, it was answered by God the moment it was thought in separation. So it didn't even go anywhere. So the ego's attempt is, of course, to preserve that reality in an instant of separation in order to keep and hold it real. And of course, here comes then in all what he said about where the soul is really not part of that uh, returning home, of the transformation of mind. That the term salvation, that is really not different than as we were using forgiveness in its true sense and totality. So it doesn't apply to the soul. The soul is where the mind is in one-mindedness. This is what we are here for, to bring into awareness, into experience, the one-mindedness, the connection as one mind, as one self, as one soul. And on the way, everything else, how he explains it, we call right-mindedness. That's where the miracle-mindedness comes in place and has its place. Okay. Continuing here, test constructors recognize that there are different kinds of validity and also that they are of different orders. This means that they do not mean truth and do not pretend to mean it. Test validity can be judged by logic. So he's talking here, as far as I understand it, I'm not a professional at that, but in psychology, everything is also, you have to test it. There are probabilities and there are tests for that. And so he talks here about what Helen and Bill, what their job was also in the psychology department, to test validity. Test validity can be judged by logic, by theory, and by practice, each being regarded as a different dimension. In each case, the amount of confidence is expressed in some form of percentage, either quantitatively or merely in terms of high, moderate, and low. If it is reliable, if the result is then reliable, or if it can be said, yes, this is so, or there's a high probability that it is so. But a hypothesis is tested as either true or false, to be accepted or rejected accordingly. If it is shown to be true, it becomes a fact after which no one attempts to evaluate it unless its status as fact is questioned. Every idea which the ego has accorded the status of fact is questionable. And we should, of course, question everything that has been stated as a fact, and somehow the mind has the sense and has the strong sense through its mind training, as I mentioned it in the beginning, that no, that's not the truth, or that's not what where we are going along, or where we really remember who we are and where we join. So questionable. Has accorded the status of fact is questionable because facts are in the realm of knowledge. Confusing realms of discourse is a thinking error which philosophers have recognized for centuries. Confusing realms. Psychologists are generally quite deficient in this respect, as are many theologians. Data from one realm of discourse do not mean anything in another realm of discourse. because they can be understood only within the thought systems of which they are a part. This is why psychologists are concentrating increasingly on the ego in an attempt to unify the clearly unrelated data. It need hardly be said that an attempt to relate the unrelated cannot succeed. The recent ecological emphasis is but a more ingenious way of trying to impose order on chaos. Interesting, isn't it? And that is basically dictated in 1965. No? The recent ecological emphasis is but a more ingenious way of trying to impose order on chaos. We have already credited the ego with considerable ingenuity, though not with creativeness. But it should always be remembered that inventiveness is really wasted effort. Oh my God, inventiveness is wasted effort, even in its most ingenious forms. We do not have to explain anything. This is why we need not trouble ourselves. And here we're going to finish for today with inventiveness. The highly specific nature of invention is not worthy of the abstract creativity of God's creation. You see where it directs us into the complete abstract nature of who we are in as God created us, which is basically God is abstract, and therefore his son is also abstract. And so creativity is indeed abstract. And everything else, I mean, what does the lesson say? I have invented the world I see, isn't it? That's lesson, is it 33 or 32? And so the inventiveness and all the inventions, because every human mind has invented, even if you're not a physics inventor or a technical inventor, but you have invented ideas, you have invented yourself, you have invented the expression of yourself in behavior, you have invented the world, you have invented yourself as you see yourself. And that is what Jesus teaches. The highly specific nature of invention is not worthy of the abstract creativity of God's creations, which we are, who you are, what we are. Beautiful, beautiful. I love it. Really nice, really awesome. So, what is the time? Yes, we are pretty much through. Everything good in the kingdom, isn't it? Good to know you as that love and light and peace, and in that experience of seeing each other in a right-minded way, entering into knowing myself, knowing yourself, entering this one-mindedness and knowing each other to be joined in creative mind in God himself. And this allows us to really be completely present here and now, without any need of staying on the timeline or defining anything on the timeline, looking further into the future, how everything gets better. We are literally liberated, relieved from this burden. And of course, the accomplishment, and that what was asked, was just to go along and to really will that recognition above all else, and to be willing to change our minds, to think differently, to perceive everyone and everything differently. That's it, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes. Love to all the brothers. See you everywhere. Here's still some sounds to join in for our blessing moments in quietness.